Demetrius, from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Hugh Clough. He had not long been master of Athens before he had formed designs against Lacedaemon, of which Archidamus the king, being advertised, came out and met him. But he was overthrown in a battle near Mantinea, after which Demetrius entered Laconia and, in a second battle near Sparta itself, defeated him again with the loss of 200 Lacedaemonians slain and 500 taken prisoner. And now it was almost impossible for the city, which hitherto had never been captured, to escape his arms. But certainly there never was any king upon whom fortune made such short turns, nor any other life or story so filled with her swift and surprising changes, over and over again, from small things to great, from splendor back to humiliation, and from utter weakness once more to power and might. They say in his sadder vicissitudes he used sometimes to apostrophize fortune, in the words of Aeschylus, "Thou liftest up to cast us down again." And so at this moment, when all things seemed to conspire together to give him his heart's desire of dominion and power, news arrived that Lysimachus had taken all his cities in Asia, and that Ptolemy had reduced all Cyprus with the exception of Salamis, and that in Salamis his mother and children were shut up and close besieged, and yet, like the woman in Archilochus, water in one deceitful hand she shows, while burning fire within her other glows. The same fortune that drew him off with these disastrous tidings from Sparta, in a moment after opened upon him a new and wonderful prospect of the following kind: Cassander, king of Macedon, dying, and his eldest son Philip, who succeeded him, not long surviving his father. The two younger brothers fell at variance concerning the succession, and Antipater, having murdered his mother Thessalonica, Alexander, the younger brother, called in to his assistance Plutarch out of Epirus, and Demetrius out of the Peloponnese. Plutarch arrived first, and taking in recompense for his succor a large slice of Macedonia, had made Alexander begin to be aware that he had brought upon himself a dangerous neighbor, and that he might not run a yet worse hazard from Demetrius, whose power and reputation were so great. The young man hurried away to meet him at Dium, whither he, who on receiving his letter had set out on his march, was now come, and offering his greetings and grateful acknowledgments, he at the same time informed him that his affairs no longer required the presence of his ally. Thereupon he invited him to supper. There were not wanting some feelings of suspicion on either side already, and when Demetrius was now on his way to the banquet, someone came and told him that in the midst of the drinking he would be killed. Demetrius showed little concern, but making only a little haste, he sent to the principal officers of his army, commanding them to draw out the soldiers and make them stand to their arms, and ordered his retinue, more numerous a good deal than that of Alexander, to attend him into the very room of the entertainment, and not to stir from thence till they saw him rise from the table. Thus Alexander's servants, finding themselves overpowered, had not courage to attempt anything, and indeed Demetrius gave them no opportunity, for he made a very short visit, and pretending to Alexander that he was not at present in health for drinking wine, left early, and even an ounce of alcohol in a 24-hour period, it damages the brain and other organs in that concentration. You don't have to drink vodka and and the next day he occupied himself in preparations for departing, telling Alexander he had received intelligence that obliged him to leave, and begging him to excuse so sudden a parting. He would hope to see him further when his affairs allowed him leisure. Alexander was only too glad, not only that he was going, but that he was doing so of his own motion, without any offence, and proposed to accompany him into Thessala. But when they came to Larissa, new invitations paused between them, new professions of goodwill, covering new conspiracies, by which Alexander put himself into the power of Demetrius. For as he did not like to use precautions on his own part, for fear Demetrius should take the hint to use them on his, the very thing he meant to do was first done to him. He accepted an invitation and came to Demetrius's quarters, and when Demetrius, while they were still supping, rose from the table and went forth, the young man rose also, and followed him to the door, where Demetrius, as he passed through, only said to the guards, "Kill him that follows me," and went on, and Alexander was at once dispatched by them, together with such of his friends as endeavored to come to his rescue, one of whom, before he died, said, "You have been one day too quick for us." The night following was one, as may be supposed, of disorder and confusion. And with the morning, the Macedonians, still in alarm and fearful of the forces of Demetrius, on finding no violence offered, but only a message sent from Demetrius, desiring an interview and opportunity for explanation of his actions, at last began to feel pretty confident again, and prepared to receive him favorably. And when he came, there was no need of much being said. Their hatred of Antipater for his murder of his mother, and the absence of any one better to govern them, soon decided them to proclaim Demetrius king of Macedon. And into Macedonia they at once started and took him. And the Macedonians at home, who had not forgotten, are forgiven the wicked deeds committed by Cassander on the family of Alexander, were far from sorry at the change. Any kind recollections that still might subsist of the plain and simple rule of the first Antipater went also to the benefit of Demetrius and his son by her. A boy already old enough to be serving in the army with his father was the natural successor to the government. To add to this unexpected good fortune, news arrived that Ptolemy had dismissed his mother and children, bestowing upon them presents and honors, and also that his daughter Stratonice, whom he had married to Seleucus, was remarried to Antiochus, the son of Seleucus, and proclaimed Queen of Upper Asia. And Asia is typically not, if you look at Greek sources, back then, they weren't talking about, they weren't talking about the Persians, or they weren't talking about the Hindus and Chinese and stuff. They were talking about, closer to Greece. Asia Minor, as we call it. For Antiochus, it appears, had fallen passionately in love with Stratonique, the young queen, who had already made Seleucus the father of a son. He struggled very hard with the beginning of this passion, and at last, resolving with himself that his desires were wholly unlawful. Well, desires, I would disagree with that being the case, but certain actions upon them, then you run into something different. But if you're going after the queen, oh yeah, it doesn't take much for some king or something to kill you. His malady past all cure, and his powers of reason too feeble to act, he determined on death, and thought to bring his life slowly to extinction by neglecting his person and refusing nourishment under the pretense of being ill. Erasistratus, the physician who attended him, quickly perceived that love was his distemper, but the difficulty was to discover the object. Now, you actually don't know, when you involve yourself with adultery, who is going to kill the person or people involved or whatever. So that alone should kind of indicate that, it's not a risk to take at the very least if you don't have the morals or whatever. He, therefore, waited continually in his chamber, and when any of the beauties of the court made their visit to the sick prince, he observed the emotions and alterations in the countenance of Antiochus, and watched for the changes which he knew to be indicative of the inward passions and inclinations of the soul. He took notice that the presence of other women produced no effect upon him, but when Stratonique came, as she often did, alone or in company with Seleucus, to see him, he observed in him all Sappho's famous symptoms. His voice faltered, his face flushed up, his eyes glanced stealthily. A sudden sweat broke out on his skin. The beatings of his heart were irregular and violent, and unable to support the excess of his passion, he would sink into a state of faintness, prostration, and pallor. Erasistratus, reasoning upon these symptoms, just when I thought my stomach's better, and upon the probabilities of things, considering that the king's son would hardly, if object of his passion had been any other, have persisted to the death, rather than reveal it, felt, however, the difficulty of making a discovery of this nature to Seleucus, but trusting to the tenderness of Seleucus for the young man, spoke out and told him the malady was love. But trusting to the tenderness of Seleucus for the young man, he put on all the assurances he could, and at last, on some opportunity, spoke out and told him the malady was love, a love impossible to gratify or relieve. The king was extremely surprised and asked, "Why impossible to relieve?" "The fact is," replied Erasistratus, "he is in love with my wife." "How?" said Seleucus. "And will our friend Erasistratus refuse to bestow his wife upon my son and only successor, when there is no other way to save his life?" Yeah, people nowadays think, no. there's no wrong being done to anybody because they're not fulfilling people's desires. Now, if there's spouses or something, that's kind of maybe different, but you know what I mean. You replied, Erasistratus, who are his father, would not do so if he were in love with Stratonique. Yeah, I don't actually know if the recording's picking up the grumbling in the stomach that I hear this, but I can't mention that. But anyways, you replied, Erasistratus, who are his father, would not do so if he were in love with Stratonique. Ah, my friend, answered Seleucus, would to heaven any means, human or divine, could but convert his present passion to that, it would be well for me to part, not only with Stratonique, but with my empire, to save Antiochus. This he said with the greatest passion, shedding tears as he spoke, upon which Erasistratus, taking him by the hand, replied, in that case you have no need of Erasistratus for you, who are the husband, the father, and the king are the proper physician for your own family. Seleucus, accordingly, summoning a great... okay, I guess there's another program after this. Summoning a general assembly of his people, declared to them that he had resolved to make Antiochus king and Stratonique queen of all the provinces of Upper Asia, uniting them in marriage, telling them that he thought he had sufficient power over the prince's will, that he should find in him no repugnance to obey his commands, and for Stratonique he hoped all his friends would endeavor to make her sensible, if she should manifest any reluctance to such a marriage, that she ought to esteem those things just and honorable which had been determined upon by the king as necessary to the general good. In this manner, we are told, was brought about the marriage of Antiochus and Stratonique. To return to the affairs of Demetrius, having obtained the crown of Macedon, he presently became master of Thessaly also, and holding the greatest part of the Peloponnesus, and on the side of the Isthmus, the cities of Megara and Athens, he now turned his arms against the Boeotians. They at first made overtures for accommodation, but Cleonomus of Sparta, having ventured with some troops of their to their assistance, having made his way into Thebes and Pisces, the Thespian, who was their first man in power and reputation, animating them to make a brave resistance, they broke off the treaty. No sooner, however, had Demetrius begun to approach the walls with his engines, but Cleonomus, in affright, secretly withdrew, and the Boeotians, finding themselves abandoned, made their submission. Demetrius placed a garrison in charge of their towns, and having raised a large sum of money from them, he placed Hieronymus, the historian, in the office of governor and military commander over them, and was thought on the whole to have shown great clemency, more particularly to Pisces, to whom he did no hurt, but spoke with him courteously and kindly, and made him chief magistrate of Thespia. Not long after, Lysimachus was taken prisoner by Dramycates, and Demetrius went off instantly, in the hopes of possessing himself of Thrace, thus left without a king. Upon this, the Boeotians revolted again. The news also came that Lysimachus had regained his liberty, so Demetrius, turning back quickly, and in anger, found on coming up that his son Antigonus had already defeated the Boeotians in battle, and therefore proceeded to lay siege again. Thebes. But understanding that Parhas had made an incursion into Thessaly, and that he was advanced as far as Thermopylae, leaving Antigonus to continue the siege, he marched with the rest of his army to oppose this enemy. Parhas, however, made a quick retreat, so leaving 10,000 foot and 1,000 horse for the protection of Thessaly, he returned to the siege of Thebes, and there brought up his famous city-taker to the attack, which, however, was so laboriously and so slowly moved on account of its bulk and heaviness that in 2 months it did not advance 2 furlongs. In the meantime, the citizens made a stout defense, and Demetrius, out of heat and contentiousness, very often, more than any necessity, sent his soldiers into danger, until at last Antigonus, observing how many men were losing their lives, said to him, "Why, my father, do we go on letting the men be wasted in this way, without any need of it?" But Demetrius, in a great passion, interrupted him. "And you, good sir, why do you afflict yourself for the matter? Will dead men come to you for rations?" But that the soldiers might see that he valued his own life at no dearer rate than theirs, he exposed himself freely, and was wounded with a javelin through his neck, which put him into great hazard of his life. But, notwithstanding, he continued the siege, and in conclusion took the town again. And after his entrance, when the citizens were in fear and trembling, and expected all the severities which an incensed conqueror could inflict, he only put to death 13 and banished some few others, pardoning all the rest. Thus the city of Thebes, which had not yet been 10 years restored, in that short space, was twice besieged and taken. Shortly after, the festival of the Pythian Apollo was to be celebrated, and the Attalians, having blocked up all the passages to Delphi, Demetrius held the games and celebrated the feast at Athens, alleging it was a great reason those honors should be paid in that place. Apollo being the paternal entity of the Athenian people, and the reputed first founder of the race. So it could be a divinized prehistoric hero. A lot of that went on, and they even saw it being done with Alexander the Great. So shortly after, the festival of the Pythian Apollo was to be celebrated, and the Attalians, having blocked up all the passages to Delphi, Demetrius held the games and celebrated the feast at Athens, alleging it was great reason that those honors should be paid in that place. Apollo, being the paternal entity of the Athenian people, and the reputed first founder of their race. I pointed with my finger, I reread the paragraph. From thence, Demetrius returned to Macedon, and as he not only was of a restless temper himself, but saw also that the Macedonians were ever the best subjects when employed in military expeditions, but turbulent and desirous of change in the idleness of peace, he led them against the Attalians, and having wasted their country, he left Antiochus with a great part of his army to complete the conquest, and with the rest he marched in person to find out Parhas, who in like manner was advancing to encounter him. But so it fell out that by taking different ways, the two armies did not meet. But whilst Demetrius entered Epirus, and laid all waste before him. Plutarch fell upon Pentaucus, and in battle, in which the two commanders met in person and wounded each other, he gained the victory and took 5,000 prisoners, besides great numbers slain of the field. The worst thing, however, for Demetrius was that Plutarch had excited less animosity as an enemy than admiration as a brave man. His taking so large a part with his own hand in the battle had gained him the greatest name and glory among the Macedonians. Many of them began to say that this was the only king in whom there was any likeness to be seen of the great Alexander's courage. The other kings, and particularly Demetrius, did nothing but personate him, like actors on a stage, in his pomp and outward majesty. And Demetrius, truly, was a perfect play and pageant, with his robes and diadems, his gold-edged purple, and his hats with double streamers, his very shoes being of the richest purple felt, embroidered over in gold. One robe in particular, a most superb piece of work, was long in the loom in preparation for him, in which was to be wrought the representation of the universe and the celestial bodies. This wrought the representation this left unfinished when his reverse overtook him, and not any one of the kings of Macedon. His successors, through diverse of them, haughty enough, ever presumed to use. Now, one of the things that we should probably look at is, through such things, what did these aspects of the universe mean to these people? And, of course, what did they know about them? And representation wasn't exactly always the same as just making a chart, but some very, very accurate stuff can be shown in some of these charts. Some of these representations. But it was not this theatric pomp alone which disgusted the Macedonians, but his profuse and luxurious way of living, and above all, the difficulty of speaking with him, or of obtaining access to his presence, for either he would not be seen at all, or, if he did give audience, he was violent and overbearing. Thus he made the envoys of the Athenians, to whom yet he was more attentive than to all other Grecians, wait 2 whole years before they could obtain a hearing, and when the Lacedaemonians sent a single person on an embassy to him, he held himself insulted and asked angrily whether it was the fact that the Lacedaemonians had sent but one ambassador. Yes, was the happy reply he received, one ambassador to one king. Once, when, in some apparent fit of more popular and acceptable temper, he was riding abroad, a number of people came up and presented their written petitions. He courteously received all these and put them up in the skirt of his cloak, while the poor people were overjoyed and followed him close. But when he came upon the bridge of the river Axius, shaking out his cloak, and threw all into the river, this excited very bitter resentment among the Macedonians, who felt themselves to be not governed, but insulted. They called to mind what some of them had seen, and others had heard related of King Philip's unambitious and open, accessible manners. One day, when an old woman had assailed him several times in the road, and importuned him to hear her after he had told her he had no time. Well, I think we're probably going to hear that it was, not a physical altercation like that, but, if so, cried she, you have no time to be a king. And this reprimand so stung the king that after thinking of it a while, he went back into the house, and setting all other matters apart for several days together, he did nothing else but receive, beginning with the old woman, the complaints of all that would come. And to do justice, truly enough, might well be called a king's first business. Mars, as says Timotheus, is the tyrant, but law, in Pindar's words, the king of all. Homer does not say that kings received at the hands of Jove besieging engines are ships of war, but sentences of justice to keep and observe, nor is it the most warlike, unjust, and murderous, but the most righteous of kings, that has from him the name of Jupiter's familiar friend and scholar. Demetrius's delight was the title most unlike the choice of the king of gods. No. Yeah, I don't think anybody should want to be called that. But, the divine names were those of the defender and keeper. His was that of the besieger of cities. The place of virtue was given by him to that which, had he not been as ignorant as he was powerful, he would have known to be vice, and honor by his act was associated with crime. While he lay dangerously ill at Pella, Parhas pretty nearly overran all Macedon, and advanced as far as the city of Edessa. On recovering his health, he quickly drove him out, and came to terms with him, being desirous not to employ his time in a string of petty local conflicts with the neighbor, when all his thoughts were fixed upon another design. This was no less than to endeavor the recovery of the whole empire which his father had possessed, and the preparations were suitable to his hopes and the greatness of the enterprise. He had arranged for levying of 98,000 foot and nearly 12,000 horse, and he had a fleet of 500 galleys on the stocks, some building at Athens, others at Corinth and Chalcis, and in the neighborhood of Pella, and he himself was passing evermore from one to another of these places, to give his directions and his assistance to the plans, while all that saw were amazed not so much at the number as at the magnitude of the works. Hitherto there had never been seen a galley with 15 or 16 ranges of oars. At a latter time, Ptolemy Philopator built one of 40 rows, which was 280 cubits in length, and the height of her to the top of her stern 48 cubits. Elbow to fingertip, right? I guess I'll throw in a comment. I don't think I'm going to finish that paragraph. When the individual called as a prophet, one of the things you're going to see is that there's not going to be this doubt levied. Are they just going to trying to restore or build up their ancestral kingdom or something like that? Sure, some of them were from kings, but there's not that thought associated with them.